Hello and welcome to the M.B.M podcast, where you'll learn to master the business of yoga. M.B.M is a proud part of the Wander Barn podcast network, and I'm your host, Amanda Kingsmith. I'm a 500-hour registered yoga teacher, a yoga business coach, and a total business geek. Here at M.B.M, you'll learn everything you need to know to create a sustainable yoga business by learning from myself and guests from around the world about how they built their yoga businesses, and about how you too can become a successful yoga teacher, studio owner, and much more. All right, let's dive in. Hey friends, I just wanted to pop in and talk a little bit about M.B.M behind the scenes. When I entered the yoga world as a teacher, I was surprised by how many yoga teachers were struggling with the business side of yoga. And that's why I created M.B.M. M.B.M helps yoga teachers and studio owners become entrepreneurs. It helps you to go from surviving to thriving with your yoga business. I am on a mission to change the yoga industry, to teach yoga teachers and studio owners about the business of yoga, and to help you feel more confident, successful, and abundant. After releasing hundreds of podcast episodes, I want to create content that dives deeper into helping yoga entrepreneurs thrive and elevate their businesses. This is where M.B.M Behind the Scenes comes in. Each week, you will get bonus content from the weekly guest or myself, diving deeper into how you can take the teachings and apply them to your business. This podcast is designed for yoga teachers and studio owners who are ready to take it to the next level. If you enjoy M.B.M and have been looking for an affordable way to learn more, this is it. For the cost of 2 lattes per month, you will get never-before-heard content that you can't access anywhere else that will give you tangible ways to dive deeper into your yoga business. If this sounds like something you're interested in, let's dive in. Head on over to patreon.com/MBM Yoga and sign up to get behind the scenes now. Once again, that's patreon.com/MBOM Yoga to get all the exclusive behind the scenes content. I'll see you there. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the M.B.M podcast. I'm so excited that you're joining me for today's episode of the show. This episode is brought to you by OfferingTree, an all-in-one, easy-to-use online business platform that I've been working with for years. If you're looking to save time, energy, and money, check out OfferingTree. And don't forget to grab your special discount at offeringtree.com/MBM. And this week on the podcast, I am thrilled to be joined by Michelle Knight. Michelle Knight is a branding and marketing strategist and the founder of Brandmerry, where she helps female entrepreneurs create a captivating and money-making brand through the power of story. Michelle has helped countless yoga teachers master their own stories to attract more long-term clients, and that's exactly what we're diving into today. Michelle shares how we can use storytelling on our websites, our bios, and on our social media to help people get to know who we are and what we offer through sharing our experiences and the stories that we've experienced in our lives. She also shares how to decide what stories to tell, what boundaries to set when it comes to storytelling and what you share with the world, how to repurpose your stories and content across multiple platforms, and so much more. So we are covering a ton in this episode. This was such a fun conversation, and I'm so excited to share it with you. So without further ado, here is Michelle. Welcome to the podcast today, Michelle. I'm really excited to have you here with me.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited for our chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you share with listeners just a little bit about who you are and what you do and all of that goodness?
Yes, of course. So I'm Michelle Knight, and I founded my company Brandmerry in 2016 after the birth of my son. So I was navigating a unexpected postpartum period, and unexpectedly also a desire to start my own business, something I had never really thought about before. I actually genuinely loved my work in the nonprofit sector, but was feeling this pull to do something bigger and set out on the wonderful adventure of starting a business from scratch. So made a lot of mistakes, spent a lot of time, doing the branding things that you do, building the website, the back end, planning my offer, and found myself about 8 months in with 0 clients. So I quickly really started to self-assess and find out, why was this happening? And I realized that the brand that I had created and the messaging that I was putting out in my marketing wasn't really authentic to me and my story. So I scrapped the entire thing, did a little personal deep dive with a journal, and kind of redid my website in a weekend and started showing up in this new authentic way through storytelling, and found myself starting to sign clients. And they weren't new clients. They were people who had always been there. But suddenly something that I was saying and how I was saying it started, resonating with them. And I rode that momentum train and hit 6 figures in a year, and have built my business to a point where I have retired my husband, and him, my son, and I travel the world. So we spent 2 years in an RV, and now we're those digital nomads. I know you can relate to that. And I built my entire business on the sole purpose of supporting entrepreneurs in branding themselves online, marketing their message, and creating more income and impact.
Yeah, I love that. And it's also really cool because I host a couple different podcasts, and traveling and digital nomad life is really close to my heart, since that's like a big part of my story and my journey and whatnot, which we were talking about before we hit record. And it's really cool to kind of to be talking with somebody who is doing that as well, and has done that as well, but to be talking about it with M.B.M and that type of thing, because it's really rare that I have people on the show who have a similar lifestyle. Like more often than not these days, especially, like people work from home or they're working remotely, but they don't necessarily have that travel piece. So I think that that's really cool.
Yeah, it's such a key part of my story. And it's something that we always wanted to have in place, but didn't really know how we were going to do that. And then my business, through the, continuation of that, we let that unfold. And now we just let travel kind of guide our lives and all of our decisions.
Amazing. I love that. We definitely do the same thing as well. So
Yes.
we're in the same boat with that. And one thing that you were saying just with your own story that I really connected with is this idea of connecting with your people and sharing your story. Because I think this is something that I feel like is super relevant for yoga teachers. Because I think often we think like, okay, I'm here for a yoga class. I'm here to teach a yoga class. I'm going to just, teach the philosophy. I'm going to teach the asana, the physical side. And they don't think about the fact that like people become curious about who you are and what your story is. Can we talk a little bit about how this is sort of like a really important piece of our brand?
Absolutely. So I think that, there's a couple of different pieces that I like to emphasize when it comes to storytelling. Number one is that you've got to get eyes on your brand, right? So like people need to know about you, especially for yoga teachers before they even get on the mat. Or if you're teaching digitally, the mat in their home that you're broadcasting via Zoom or whatever, they need to get in the door, and storytelling is a really great way to do that and to build that connection. In addition to that, people care about the person behind the brand. Studies show, research shows that that is true. The second most visited page on a website is the About Me page. And the reason for that, product, service, whatever, is because people want to know, like, who am I ultimately investing in, right? Like, who is this person? Do I share values with that person? Can I trust this person? 81% of consumers say that they need to trust a brand before they make a purchase decision. That's a big number. And so when we focus more on storytelling as a way to build connection and trust, we have found that it actually leads to an increase in income and impact.
Yeah, that's so interesting to hear that there's been studies done with that. And I mean, I definitely like get that. Even as a consumer, I can think about if I'm going to book, coaching or sign up for a course or something like that. I want to know who's creating it, and being able to read a little bit about them is so helpful to see, just who they are and if I have any connection with them. I think one thing that I think could be really valuable is, so you mentioned like the about page. So
Mhm.
say somebody does go to, say a yoga teacher's website, they're deciding if they want to take a class with them or not. How much do we actually share on, an about page or in a bio? Because I completely agree with you that having your story in there is important, but also you got to find that balance of like, I guess not oversharing or
Yeah.
writing like your entire life story on a website where somebody is like, whoa, I don't have time for this.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that, one of the things that differentiates storytelling and maybe a book from storytelling in business is that at the end of the day, your audience you need them to take action, right? We're not just telling stories to tell stories. We're telling stories to move our potential client through the buying process, ultimately to a paying customer, because we've got businesses here. This is what we're doing. And so, I think when it comes to storytelling, one of the things that we want to remember is even though we're the ones sharing the stories, and even if it's our story, it still has to be about our audience. And so when you're crafting any story, but especially your About Me page, you want to really think about your brand story, right? Or origin story, you can call it whatever the heck you want. What's ultimately led you to doing the work that you're doing today, and what parts of that journey will connect deeply with your audience. So yoga specifically, right? Why did you turn to yoga in your own life? Why did you fall in love with it? Why is it something that you practice? How is this tied to the mission and the work that you want to put out into the world? Is there a specific type of yoga that you've chosen, and why have you chosen that? So these are all different, ways that you can not only build authority with your audience, but also find those connection pieces to build empathy with them as well.
Yeah, I love that. I'm completely on the same page with that. It's one of the activities I get yoga teachers that I train to do when we're working on creating like our bios or something like that, is to think about like their why for being in teacher training. Like, how did you get to this point where you're writing this story and wanting to share this practice? And I feel like that why of getting there, or that like defining moment when you're like, I need to teach this, is so huge in terms of like how you're going to bring this practice into the world and how you're going to show up and what's going to make you unique. And I think those are like, obviously people want to know like what types of classes you teach and, what level it is. Like that's important to them too. But I think they really feel curious, like, how do you connect to this practice and
Mhm.
how can I learn from that? Which I think is something that sometimes we can just think about like, oh, nobody's going to care about that. Like nobody's going to care about like me being injured or me going through grief or a breakup or something like that. But it's like, that's actually what brings a lot of other people to yoga. Like that might be why your students there, and knowing that you've gone through that could really help them connect to that.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. You know what I mean? Like by not sharing that, you might be missing a connection piece, which could turn somebody into a lifelong fan of your brand. And so that's where those pieces of like your journey and really bringing them to the service are so important, because that relatability and that connection is key. I mean, we know that people make purchase decisions based on some sort of emotional connection, and not just like this class at this time, And so making that connection and really understanding your audience and knowing, wow, I tend to attract a lot of people who, have been going through the grieving process or navigating through that. Me sharing my story lets them know that this is a space for them where they are going to get support. And that is definitely going to elevate you to another level than, hey, I've got a class at 7 p.m.
Yeah, for sure. 100%. I really love that. And so we've talked a little bit about how, including your story in your like About Me page or your bio can be really beneficial. How do we weave this story throughout kind of everything we do, like the rest of our website? And then maybe we can start with the website and then carry on to like the other materials that we create as business
Yeah.
owners.
I'd love to. So I always start with the About Me page or the brand story, because it's the one we all want to start with, right? Like I've worked with enough entrepreneurs to know that they want to write their brand story out of the gate and get that solid. The thing is, your brand story will evolve. So I also give you permission to go back and update your About Me page as needed. But from your About Me page, it's important to incorporate what I like to refer to as a micro stories into every single piece of content that you create. So whether that's your homepage or individual blog post, or as we're talking about kind of carrying over into social media, social content, videos. And the reason for that is not only that connection piece, but also that the art of sharing stories actually makes your content more memorable. So you're 22 times more memorable when you intertwine an element of storytelling. And so I think sometimes it can feel really overwhelming when we talk about story from like a big picture, like this is my whole life story. And so when we switch our focus to micro stories and thinking of those little moments that have happened, maybe you realized something in a yoga class the other day that you wanted to share, or somebody said something to you and you wanted to talk a little bit more about that, right? It's like these little micro stories are really great elements to weave into your content. So on the homepage, I always recommend having a small version of your story where you share that why, as you mentioned, or I call it the mission because my background's a nonprofit. So it's like the mission behind the work that you do. Putting that on the homepage, again, builds that connection, piques interest right away. Obviously on the, if you are creating blog content or social media content, even a small little story as an intro into what you're talking about can be really beneficial as well. So I have a good rule of thumb, which is every single thing that you write for your business or say should have one element of story.
I love that rule of thumb. I think that that's really cool. And that's something I think even for myself, I need to remember that. I was thinking about as we were talking, I was like, I wonder if I have much like storytelling on my website. And I think it's easy to really get kind of, I guess, like stuck, maybe not stuck, but sort of think about, people don't care about this. They can go read my about page if they are interested in my story, but people are probably not that interested if they're not there. And I think that's like an interesting sort of mindset shift to go through, to remember that people do want to connect with you, even in those moments that aren't your about page. So having a little bit of your story kind of in different places on your website.
Yeah, and aside from the memorable piece, like what we know about storytelling, and I can nerd out about stats and stuff all day, but what we know about storytelling isn't so much the story that you're sharing, it's the art of storytelling. So by creating stories, because it is a universal language, we, as an audience, as a reader, things are happening in our brain that are quite magical, right? Dopamine is being released, so we're feeling good. Like this is what makes it more memorable. There's the art of neurocoupling. Again, I could nerd out about it, but that's just the connection between you and the brand. And that's really what it's about. It's less about, hey, get to know me, that is important, but yeah, they can go to the About Me page. And it's more of building that connection and that trust, which leads to those lifers, as I like to call them, right? The people who keep coming back and telling all their friends about your service.
Yeah, for sure. And so when it comes to, I guess, like choosing micro stories or something like that, how do you choose like the best little micro story to tell, or know, I guess, when it's appropriate to use micro stories and that type of thing?
Yeah. Yeah. So the first thing that I always love to kind of share is that we have to remember we're building brands. And so let's say you're showing up on Instagram, right? If you're on Instagram and the only thing you're talking about every single day is your product or your service, your audience is going to get bored really quickly, right? They want to know more about the person behind the brand, the mission, the values, all those things that we've shared before, even the fun things of like, look at my plant that I got, because it's just like, those are just very human, relatable pieces. And so when we understand that we're building a brand, then that allows us to look for stories everywhere around us, at the grocery store, like I mentioned before, in a class, maybe you're taking a class, right? Not teaching it. And what I recommend my clients do is they start like documenting these stories. Now, you don't have to document them word for word. I call it a story bank. And it's literally like a little note about what happened and, what it made you think of. And you start to heighten your awareness around storytelling, and you create this ongoing bank of cool stories that you could share. And then the second piece of that is connecting that story to how it provides value to your audience. So again, we're not just sharing stories to share stories, but how is this story going to provide value? Is it inspirational? Is it entertaining? Is it educational? Is it going to move them on in the consumer buying process? And that really gives us a strong foundation for not only showing up and sharing stories, but making sure that every single one of our stories will connect to our audience. And then from there, my clients will sometimes create a whole post around one single story, or they're planning on sharing, I don't know, a top tip to, become a master at plank, right? Get your butt down or whatever. I'm thinking about yoga specifically. And so they'll go to their story bank and find a story that they can use to introduce that piece of content.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So kind of choosing things that are relevant and I guess like relate kind of to what you're trying to share. And
Mhm.
then you sort of touched on this in terms of like, bringing it into like a whole post or something like that. So from, we build like our website, which is just one piece of our brand. And then we've got, our social media, our emails. Do you suggest then taking like, say we're writing a blog post on like how to do plank. So we
Mhm.
don't just tell somebody this is how you do plank. You can weave in a story of maybe you learning plank or learning how to teach plank or something like that that's relatable. Would you then turn that into like a social media post and then maybe also use it in like an email or something like that?
Oh yeah, I'm all about repurposing and repeating myself on a regular basis. Like I think that one of the best things we can do as brands is say the same thing over and over again, but maybe in a different way. Because we know that, repetition is key. That's how we build that, strong brand identity. But it also is important because our audience doesn't see everything that we create. So, let's say that you wrote a blog post, you absolutely can cherry pick out the story piece and just share that on social media. And then maybe the next day you say, oh, remember that story I shared with you yesterday? Here are two of those tips. Go click my blog to read the last one. And then I'm all about, then driving traffic to your blog through your email list as well. So I'm not a huge fan of putting blog content in an email because I want traffic to a website all the time. And so, pull that story blurb out, put that in your email, tell them to click through to the blog to get the tips. So there are fun ways that you can repurpose it to make sure that you're reaching your audience at every different phase.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. And I think one thing that you said that I really connect with, and this is one thing I need to practice a bit better in my own business, is this idea of like, we can repurpose and we can retell the same thing. Like, I think sometimes it's really easy for us to forget that not everyone sees our social media posts and not everyone like reads our emails. And so something you wrote or did or shared, like, even 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, for sure, that's just sitting on your feed is something that you could certainly reuse, especially if it's still relevant to you. And I sometimes will get like caught in this loop of like, oh, I need to be creating like new, fresh stuff and
Mm.
not just saying the same thing over and over again. But I think we can use repurposing in that sort of same way, especially if it is relevant to our brand.
Yeah. I mean, I could talk about repurposing all day. It's one of my favorite things to do. My clients actually inside of my membership call me the repurposing queen because they'll see a piece of content and they're like, oh, did you just share that in a blog like 2 months ago? And I'm like, heck yes, I did. Way to pay attention, So I think that when it comes to branding, let's talk about the brand story specifically with repurposing. Often we'll write that story and we'll put it on our about me page and then we'll forget about it. What would happen if every 30 days you shared that brand story on your feed so that any new followers that found you within those 30 days now knew what you were about and your mission and your why? So that's actually something I challenge my clients to do is reshare their story every 30 days on their feed. Speaking of Instagram, as we've been talking about, record a bunch of Insta stories where you kind of talk about your mission, save them as a highlight. There's a lot of different ways that we can repurpose these core stories as well. And then the other piece of it is like, it's not just, although the algorithm, is a whole thing in and of itself. And it's not just that people don't necessarily see it, but sometimes people need to hear the same thing multiple times before they actually take action on it or before they're ready. And so that's why the repetition and the repurposing is really powerful as a marketer and a content creator because we can use it to our advantage. It's not once we get over that hurdle of like, oh my gosh, somebody might have seen this already, it can be really empowering to know that you can go back to your Instagram and find your best performing post and share it again, and your audience is not going to care.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're probably not even going to notice,
They don't
honestly.
notice.
Yeah, I did a training. This is more like a personal development thing a number of years ago, and it was kind of one of my most profound takeaways from it was this idea that like we spend so much time worrying about what other people think of us, but people spend so much time thinking about what other people think of them that they're
Yeah.
really not thinking about other people, which is kind of like a little bit trippy when you start thinking about it. But I think you can apply that sort of same notion to this idea as well. Like we think, oh, people are following like every single step of this. So, we're not sharing like the beginning stages over again. Yet it's like there's lots of people, especially when it comes to newsletters and social media and, even podcasts like this, where it's like somebody might just pop in, 5 years down the road of your journey and have no idea about anything that's happened prior to that. And I think even like if somebody's dedicated and I've looked at every single one of your posts, read every single one of your emails, every single one of your blogs, I think it's cool for them to kind of hear how it all started again, to kind of see like the additional parts to that story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I've had clients who, I mean, or even community members who maybe aren't clients who have just been with me for a really long time that are like, I've heard you say this before, but not in that way. Or I've heard this story before, but I must have missed that key piece. Like we have to remember our audience has lives, like you said, and like they're not hanging on every word that we say. And when we realize that, it makes marketing and branding and storytelling and all of that a million times easier because we remove the stress of like, oh, will my audience care if I said this again? It's like they've got things going on. It's like when I see entrepreneurs they'll come to me and they'll say, well, I haven't posted on Instagram. I haven't emailed or anything. What should I say? I said, you just start showing up because I bet you your audience didn't notice. And I don't mean to say
Mm-hmm.
that in like a mean way, but that's the truth, like everyone's got their own stuff going on.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I actually gave the same advice to a client I was working with a number of months ago. She'd kind of just unintentionally hit pause right as the pandemic hit. I think there was just, everyone was like overwhelmed.
Mhm.
Life was crazy. And she's like, now it's been like, 2 months since I posted on social media. And she's like, I feel like I've worked myself into this space where I feel like I need to do this big, like, hey, I'm back type post. And I was like, I don't mean to be like rude, but I feel like there's probably a very small amount of people who have realized that you're even gone
Yeah.
because I mean, and that's like, I don't mean to be like nobody cares about you because it's not the case. I think it's just think about your own experience, especially when you're on social media or checking your emails. We get so many inputs. Like it's very rare that I'm scrolling through my Instagram stories like a mindless zombie that I'm like, oh, weird. I haven't seen from so and so in a while. Like sometimes I do think about that and I'll go check out and see what they're up to, but it's very rare that that happens because my Instagram stories just go on and on and on and on. Like I really never run out of things to look at. So it's kind of rare that I'm like thinking about, oh, I've really like missed this person's stuff or something like that.
Mm.
And that kind of sucks, obviously. But I think it's also kind of like relieving in some ways to know that, people aren't watching our every single move. And so that makes it a little bit easier for us in terms of branding, repurposing, sharing stories, all of that type of thing.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point as well of like, the majority of your audience isn't hanging on to every single word that you say, but there will be some of those people, of course, that is the point of the brand that are like, hey, haven't seen you in a while. What's going on? Guess what? They don't care if you share the same thing over and over again, like we said. So it's just like, it's really empowering to just know that repetition is acceptable. And in fact, it can put you in an advantage against your competition if you're embracing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey everyone, we're just taking a quick break from the podcast to talk about OfferingTree. I wanted to remind you about the special discount you can get with OfferingTree. I love telling yoga teachers about OfferingTree because not only is it your one-stop shop for all things that you need in your yoga business, but it is also easy to use, it's affordable, and it's truly an amazing company to work with. OfferingTree lets you sell courses, run classes, manage memberships, and so much more with just one account. That's right, just one login for all those parts of your business. One of the best parts about OfferingTree is their online store. You can sell digital content like yoga videos, challenges, and courses right from your website. If you're teaching yoga classes and looking to level up, selling digital content is the next step to growing your business. Over the last year, we've seen so much pivot and change happen in the yoga industry, and having your own unique yoga business where you offer your students different course material can be so beneficial in creating a sustainable business with diversified income. And while there's many different platforms that you can create courses on these days, OfferingTree's course tools are easy to use and they're really affordable. And if you have a website you already like, you can still use OfferingTree. But there's one other thing I want to tell you about OfferingTree that makes all the difference in the world to me and probably to you too. They're a company that truly cares about yoga teachers and the wellness industry overall. I chose to partner with OfferingTree because I love the product and I love the people. Whenever yoga teachers have a suggestion for something that they need out of the platform, they can reach out directly to the people at OfferingTree and they're actually heard. So much of the development that OfferingTree has gone through over the last year has been because of yoga teachers like yourself. So if you're looking to save time, energy, and money in your yoga business, OfferingTree is hands down the software for you. Go to offeringtree.com/M.B.O.M to learn more and get your discount. Okay, let's get back to the episode. And so I'm curious, is there ever a point where like stories become too much? Can we cross that line of like, this is too much story?
Yes. The number one mistake, as I've mentioned, is that people will make it 100% about them. So they're showing up and sharing something, and just from their perspective, just to share it. And that's not really beneficial as a business owner. We always want to, like I said before, provide value. So if you can't identify the value in the story that you're sharing, save it for later, come back to it at another time. Another thing is that sometimes we want to share stories when we're in it. And I have a pretty strong another rule that was like, we don't share stories when we're in them. We share stories, when we've got some sort of reflection or lesson or value to give. Because I also believe, as someone who, lives her life pretty openly on social media, because it's a big part of what I do and what I teach, there are also a lot of things that I consider sacred. And if I'm navigating a really difficult time or a season in my life, I don't need to openly share it with the world. It's not going to be as valuable in that moment anyways, so I might as well wait. And there's no timeline on stories, right? No one's going to be like, you can't share that story. It happened 3 years ago. Yeah, you absolutely can. Those are the greatest stories because we can look back, tell a really great story, provide that value, understand how it connects with our audience. So it's not so much that I think like a story can be too long or something like that, but I do think that there are specific stories that just need to wait.
Yeah, I think that that's a really great point to bring up. And one of the things I'm also curious about, you mentioned that there's some things that are sacred. Do you have sort of like, these are things that are like personal to me. I don't publish these publicly, like I don't talk about them.
Yeah, it's not so much that I'm like not open to talking about things, but I don't share every conversation I have with my husband on the internet.
I'm sure he's grateful for that.
Yeah, he's incredibly grateful for that. I don't share. I know that me sharing what I eat for dinner is not going to help my audience out. That's not my industry, right? If I was a food blogger, maybe. So it's more of, just really knowing my ideal customer and what's important to them. Now, with my son, there are pieces that we like to share because a lot of my audience are moms, especially with the travel piece. My audience loves that we travel with a kiddo, but I'm not sharing all of the like, oh, my son took a bath last night and like a picture of him. I'm like, those are my boundaries. And I also created a boundary a few years ago where I don't share things in the moment. I've like really run with this idea that after the fact is going to be more valuable for my audience. So people always ask me like, you're always taking photos and posting on the internet. I'm like, yeah, but those are from yesterday. Even when we travel, I'm not posting photos in real time. I'll do like a Insta story dump at the end of the day because I'm about being present. So you can still share stories and you can still show up and build trust, but you don't need it to cross over into, your personal life and completely control your life. It's just not worth it, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for sharing that. And Yeah, I do. I really like those boundaries that you've set. Like I'm also, I really agree with not sharing stuff, I guess, like as you're going through it. Cause I think
Mhm.
sometimes it's hard to share. It's hard to share what you're learning as you're learning it. And
Yes.
while sometimes it can benefit people to know what you're going through or something like that, sometimes it can also be like taken the wrong way, especially if you have a big following or depending what the thing is. Like sometimes it's nice to go through the learning part of it and do that on your own and then say like, hey, I was going through this. This is what I learned from it, et cetera, et cetera. And then also I'm very much like the same way. I don't like spending, say we're on like a day trip in Mexico. I don't want to spend my whole day just like posting Instagram stories. Like I would prefer to just post video, like take videos or take photos and then post that at a later time. And I used to think that like, oh, I'm doing like a bad job of,
Yeah.
keeping track of things I'm doing, but it's just like it really does take you out of the present moment. So I'm a big fan of that one also. And then just having, some boundaries and some, sacred things that are like not for the internet.
Yes, exactly. Like I think we think storytelling, and this might is a fear I know a lot of entrepreneurs have, is like we see storytelling, we're like, I have to put everything on the internet. And it's like that's not what strategic storytelling is about. Strategic storytelling again goes back to sharing more about who you are and your mission and the work that you do in a way that's valuable to your audience. It doesn't mean that your social media feed is your diary. And I think when we strategically, like we make that shift to strategic storytelling, to storytelling to build a business, it takes the pressure off of how we have to show up and all of the shoulds and makes it really about building trust and connection.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's really great. And yeah, I follow like, a number of influencers, especially on Instagram and stuff like that. And they'll share a lot of things that I'm like, this is like barely stuff, I tell like my closest
Yeah.
friends and they'll share so much. And I think sometimes we can get in these situations where we see other people doing things online and we're like, oh, I should be doing that. But I also think we have to really decide what those boundaries are for ourselves. And like you said too, like what's relevant. Like if I look at, an influencer sharing something about like, I don't know, like a breakup she's going through, you know, like if I was going through that, how would that benefit somebody with the business of yoga, with the business
Mhm.
I run? If there's a way I can connect it once I've gone through it and I feel comfortable sharing that, then maybe it would be relevant. But for me, it's like, I do feel like it is important to find the balance of that authenticity, your boundaries, and then that relevance piece, like you were mentioning before.
I think another really important thing that I really focus on in helping my clients with branding is understanding your values as well and let that guide you. You know, at the end of the day, you're the CEO, you're the boss, and values are really important. And sometimes we can showcase our values by actually not doing things. You know what I mean? Like if something is transparency is important to me, but also our boundaries. And those are two values that I share and I am open with my audience. So they know that I'm all about being transparent with them when necessary. But I also am going to protect myself and my energy with strong boundaries. And just by honoring those values, I am positioning myself as, an authority, as a guide, as also being authentic to what I say to be true. So I always love to tell people to let your values really lead the way for your brand and honor those because it's one of the best things that you can do.
Absolutely. I love that. And so, a question I have for you is when it comes to stories, what is the benefit of sharing stories where you're not, I guess, like the center of attention, you could say, not like the protagonist of the story as a way to build your brand credibility?
Oh yeah. So again, storytelling does not have to be about you. There's all kinds of different stories that you could share. A few that I love to focus on are the story of your niche or the story of yoga. Right. Again, this could be just the telling the story of yoga or the specific type of yoga that you're teaching. We can also tell, obviously, the stories of our brands, of ourselves, and the stories of our clients. Those are stories that I find people really just don't tell enough of. We are really quick to share a testimonial or like a nice word that someone said, but there's power in also sharing someone's story, their growth from their first class to their class now, or different things like that. Asking people, rather than saying like, we just share one sentence about, the workshop that we just did, that's okay. But also saying these open questions of like, hey, why did you sign up for this? How did you feel heading into this workshop? How do you feel now? What was your biggest takeaway? And then weaving those together to tell a story can be really powerful. And then there's also this element of, I use this term loosely, but like made up stories. They're not really made up stories, but they aren't necessarily about a specific person. They're kind of for future casting. So, these stories that we see sometimes on sales pages or websites that are like, I know right now it feels like you wake up every morning and your muscles are sore and you can't bring yourself to roll out the mat, but like imagine what it would feel like to be able to dot 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 dot. That is the art of storytelling as well, because you're telling the story about your ideal customer with this like forward thinking mentality.
Oh yeah, that's cool. I like that. And I'm curious because, all of this is great in theory. I'm curious if you have, tips or strategies for people who are like, cool, awesome. I have lots of stories, but I'm like the world's worst storyteller.
Yeah.
How do we actually like learn to tell stories well?
Yeah, well, it goes back to what we learned in school, right? Like the art of storytelling is not new, and that's one of the reasons I love it. But we can make it work for us in our new age of marketing. Every great story, movie, book we've read, play we've seen has these fundamental pieces of setting up the story, introducing some sort of tension or climax, and then offering some sort of resolve. And those are really kind of the fundamental pieces. There's some sort of character or main focus. We want to introduce a moment, right? Something that shifted or changed, or a question that was asked, or something that we realized, and then, finish the story. And that's really, those are the three key pieces to include in every story. So the one I love to share, because it's one that has served me well, that I repeat time and time again, is the single line story that I share about when I decided to start my business. And it simply says, I was sitting on the couch breastfeeding my son in a postpartum fog. And I remember looking up, turning to my husband and saying, I want to leave my job. He took a deep breath. He let it out. He looked at me and he said, okay, let's do it. And that's how my business was started, right? That's like one sentence, but in and of itself, it is a complete story.
Right. Yeah. That totally makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I
there's like,
love how I love how you did that so like quick and effortlessly.
I tell it a lot. So, there's that, you can see the character, me, where I am, you can see the climax. I turn to my husband, and then you can see the resolve, what happened. And so following that structure is really helpful and kind of strips back the mystery of storytelling. And then there's these elements that we can incorporate that just, make it even better. One of them is capturing the attention of our audience. Look, we're on social media. Capturing your audience's attention is half of the battle. So that's where telling stories through photography or choosing photos, having those really strong first sentences are really powerful. You also want to paint a picture. Don't neglect the details. That story would have sucked if I would have been like, I was sitting on the couch and I said to my husband, I'm going to leave my job. And he said, okay. Like that wouldn't have been a great story. He said, okay. And that wouldn't have been a great story. So I painted the picture. I talked about the inhale and the exhale and turning to my husband in the fog. So you're visually seeing that story, and that's really important. So incorporating that picture piece, painting a picture, and making sure that you're capturing your audience's attention is incredibly helpful when it comes to storytelling.
Amazing. Thank you for that. That's super helpful. And I know you have some amazing resources on your website, but do you have any, I guess, kind of like favorite books or blogs or something that you kind of go to learn about storytelling or to get inspiration?
Yeah, it has been a while since I did a lot of work on it, just because for me, storytelling and the fun part of it has been the art of sharing my stories and really seeing what works and what doesn't. But I will say a leader in this who I have learned a lot from as a foundation of story is Donald Miller. And he founded Story Brand. And that's really where I was first introduced to this idea of storytelling in business. And he does a fantastic job of sharing some of the pieces that we shared today, that I've now used to show up on social media, right? To turn into these micro stories. So he's a great resource. He's got a great podcast, and I want to be his friend. He just seems like a cool dude.
I love that. I don't think he's listening to this podcast, but if he is, he should reach out to you. If somebody knows somebody who knows him, have them reach out to Michelle. Yeah, let Michelle know. Maybe me too. I love that though. Is he the author of, does he have a book? I think there's a book that's like How to Build Your Story Brand or something like that.
Yeah. So he founded the company Story Brand, and he has a ton of books. So he's a author. And so he has a whole book called Build Your Story Brand. And it's really powerful.
Amazing. Yeah, I've read that book, and it is a great book. So I can vouch for that as well. I think that that's amazing. And can you share a little bit more about what you do at Brandmerry, where people can go to find all of that good stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, my purpose is really to teach entrepreneurs how to brand themselves online through the power of storytelling, and then make sure people actually see that brand through marketing. So they kind of fit together, and you do need both as an entrepreneur. And so I have a lot of different ways that I support my clients through branding courses. I have a membership on learning how to market with SEO and Pinterest and video content, and all of that information plus tons of free resources is on my website, which is brandmerry.com. It's BRANDMERRY.com. I've got blogs galore on there, so tons of resources.
Amazing. Thank you so much for this conversation, Michelle. This has been really awesome. I just love this topic, and so much of what you shared really resonates with me.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.
All right, friends, I hope that you enjoyed that episode of the podcast with Michelle Knight. I know I loved that conversation and got so much inspiration from it. And it really got me thinking about how I can use the stories in my life, in my website and my bio and my social media a little bit more to connect with students and listeners of the podcast and all of that good stuff. If you would like to continue this conversation with Michelle and I, we go behind the scenes and talk a little bit about her tips for working from home and having a lifestyle where she's on the road a lot and moving around quite a bit and, moving places and that type of thing. It was really fun to have a conversation with somebody who is also nomadic and is often on the road, and to hear some of her tips and strategies for running a business and being a mother and all of that good stuff. So if you'd like to hear more of that, you can head on over to patreon.com/M.B.M Yoga. You get access to this episode as well as all the other episodes. And of course, I'd like to say a huge thanks to our sponsor, OfferingTree. To start spending more time with students and less time with software, head on over to OfferingTree.com/M.B.M to get an exclusive discount. And of course, thanks to you. Thank you so much for listening to the show. I'm so appreciative that you're here listening to this episode and all other episodes of M.B.M. All right, that's all for me. I'll see you next week. Bye for now. Thank you so much for tuning in for this episode of the podcast. To find links, notes, resources, and everything mentioned in today and all episodes of the show, you can head on over to mbomyoga.com. You can find the podcast and myself on Facebook and social media at Mastering the Business of Yoga. And I would love for you to join the private Facebook community, Yoga Business Badasses. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please make sure you reach out to me at info@mbomyoga.com. And last of all, if you enjoyed this episode of the show, please make sure you hit subscribe and leave a review for the podcast. It would mean the world. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Namaste.